Okay, our next speaker is Jack Churchward. Now, anybody who knows anything about metaphysics, if you've been in metaphysics for years, you know the name Churchward. His great-grandfather was James Churchward. How many of you remember that? A lot of you do, because he was like a pioneer. Back in the 1920s, he was the first one to ever write anything about Lemuria, but he didn't call it Lemuria, he called it Mu. It's only been later that it was changed to Lemuria, wasn't it? When they got into talking about Lemuria and Atlantis. But his great-grandfather was the one that did all the research and came up with the first evidence of Mu. In those days, they all thought he was crazy. Nobody gave him any reliability at all. He was persecuted all his life, wasn't he? But his great-grandson, Jack, and he's been all through that with his family. A lot of them didn't believe him either. But he's going to tell the story. You're going to tell the story of how it all happened. He brought back his great-grandfather's work, and we published it because I thought we needed it back in our time. All this lost knowledge. Now everybody's writing about it, but this was the first when James Churchward wrote about the land of Mu. So the book we have published by Jack is called Lifting the Veil on the Lost Continent of Mu. And it's a big book. He has reproduced all the original photographs, the original documents, and has done his own research to add material to it. So this is a real treat. We're bringing back a pioneer's work to our time. So Jack Churchward. Okay. Okay.
Afternoon. First, I'd like to thank Dolores and Julia Cannon for having me speak today, and I'd like to thank you all for showing up and watching this presentation on a Friday afternoon. It's researching Mu, and millions of people have been exposed to the theories of my great-grandfather. Perhaps thousands, we can say, have been positively affected by that. Well, I hope to provide a little bit information today, some wild speculation, and some other information, including some new scientific information that provides perhaps a change to the current paradigm. But first, I'd like to start out, since I'm an engineer, to establish some common ground, a common frame of reference, because what I might think is normal perhaps is different for other people. So these are some of the terms, and we'll go through them. First of all, when I first hear of lost continents or sunken lands, there's two kinds. Obviously, I think of these two first. We'll get to there. And there's Mu here, and you can see Atlantis on the same map. And here is Lemuria. Some other lost continents and sunken lands, the two kinds I was speaking about, are old and very old. The very old ones are in green. You can see off the west coast of Australia here, Tasmania. There's a recently discovered sunken land that's millions of years old. It's 24,000 square miles, about half the size of the state of Arkansas. Another one is the Darwin Rise over here in the Pacific. Now, when you're speaking about historical things that have been written about, there's the lost city of Dwarka off the western coast of India. We can talk about the Mediterranean Sea, where recently they uncovered the remains of Heraklion, which was written down, but no one had ever known it was there, but until they finally found it about 5 years ago. And then we have Doggerland here in the North Sea. These were all above sea level in the before the last ice age. Also, the University of South Florida, or the University of Florida, has been doing excavations 20 miles out in the Gulf of Mexico and bringing up the remains of humans and human civilizations. So that's what I think about when I think about lost continents and sunken lands. As far as mental powers, I think of what is available to an individual that they can do on their own. It's completely inherent to their character and abilities, as opposed to spiritual powers, where you call on some external entity to provide that power for you. And for lack of a better term, a magical power. So that when individuals take the opportunity to understand their relationship with the universe and understand the underlying mysteries of how the universe operates, they're able to manipulate external entities and powers and physical objects to do what they want to do. Now, if I could set up the three of them, if I have a rock sitting over there and I wanted to move it, if I just used my brain and it just got up and started to move, I'd call that a mental power. And if I were sitting here and I prayed to some external entity and I asked them to provide the power to move it, that would be a spiritual power. But a magic power would be, I would just know how to make the rock really light and how to create a wind, and it would move all by itself. Advanced civilizations. When I think of advanced civilizations, first of all, I want to know what measure you're going to use to categorize it. There can be technology-based. They have little gadgets to do everything, but there are also other advanced civilizations that can be noted. For instance, when we do archaeological excavations, they have textiles that they're pulling out of the ground that some are more advanced than what we've discovered and we have today. But yet we don't have the little gadget that produced that, so you can't point to it. Likewise, there's the colossal structures that have been created, but nobody has gone through and shown me how they can move them, or that kind of technology is missing. So another way perhaps to look at advanced civilization is quality of life. Can they provide sustenance and shelter for their entire population so that nobody goes hungry? And then there's also the governance aspect of it. Can individuals be free in their homes? They don't have to worry about somebody breaking in. They have everything they need, and the government pretty much takes care of them. Now, catastrophes. We can find out that catastrophes are civilization-ending events, earth-impacting comets, earthquakes, volcanoes that absolutely wipe out places. So the people called the Mahakari in Japan, they believed that Mu and Atlantis were taken out by a nuclear war. My great-grandfather thought it was the collapse of the Archean gas belts, and we'll go into that a little later. So when I hear the term Lemuria, I think of the Indian Ocean continent that was proposed by Schlachter in 1864 to discuss the distribution of lemurs around the Indian Ocean basin. When I think of Mu, I think of the Pacific Ocean continent that my great-grandfather said were another proposed place of the birthplace of mankind, as well as one of the central tenets of his theories. Now, obviously, some people have combined the two. As you can see here on the left, this is from the Children of Mu, the 1931 Children of Mu, and I got this one off a website not too long ago. So let me tell you a little bit about my great-grandfather and our family. William Churchward was born in 1529 to Father Gabriel, and their family property is Hill House in Devonshire, England. Until the 20th century, it was the oldest private residence in England. Now, the Hill House Churchwards were yeoman farmers for several centuries. The Hill House was built in 1440 and was given to the family by royal decree. Although I am showing a coat of arms, the line where this was awarded at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 has died out, but it does have a little bit to do with me. All of us, I guess, are a little bit of gentle in manner, and that's what the Latin phrase at the bottom means. Now, James was born in Bridestow in Devonshire. He was one of 5 boys and 4 girls. Perhaps some of you have read some of his younger brother's books. He was a noted surgeon, and he wrote a lot of books on Freemasonry. Until 10, he lived in near Dartmoor, and then he moved to Oakhampton and later London. Now, in 1871, James married Lady Julia Churchward, and they were plantation owners. No, actually it was Stephenson, but they owned tea plantations in Ceylon, or now known as Sri Lanka. And James was a tea planter from 1872 to 1879. My grandfather, James Alexander, was born in September of 1872 in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And James' Pacific travels began in 1879, and some of his personal correspondence, he speaks of taking a trip with his Uncle Willie. Now, his Uncle Willie, I believe, was William Brown Churchward, the British consul to the island of Samoa. He wrote a couple books, My Consulate in Samoa and Blackbirding in the Pacific, The First White Man on the Beach, I believe was the name of it. Now, when he did reach the United States in the late 1880s, James met up with Alice and Augustus Le Plongeon, and they had spent quite a bit of time in Chichen Itza. And during the afternoon, on Sunday afternoon chats, as you can discover in Percy Tate Griffith wrote a biography of James. It's an unpublished biography in 1936, the year after he was born, and he talks about how James interacted with them, and they had quite vivid discussions. He was an engineer as well. He had 31 patents. In 1910, he sued Bethlehem Steel Company for $16 million for patent infringement. James had designed armor plating for warships and whatnot, and they stole his patent and sold millions and millions to the government. So he sued them and got a big award, and he moved to Lakeville, Connecticut after buying a large plot of land on a lake with an unpronounceable name. I would try, and so in 1914 he began again on his research of Mu. Sorry. Now, he was an avid sportsman, and he wrote articles on fishing and hunting, as well as in Recreation magazine. He also has some of his 2 earlier books. You can find them on my website. They were done as travel documents for the main railroads. He was on WNYC starting in 1924 to 1925. One of the lectures I find most interesting was pygmy hunting in Central America. I really want to find a copy of that so I can find out what did he do when he found them. So in 1926 he came out with Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men. In 1927 he wrote a book called Copies of Stone Tablets Found by William Niven. I'll stop it there, but it's a lot longer. And he sent that only to his publisher. I have recently received a copy and done my own bit of research on it, and hopefully one day everyone will be reading that as well. In 1931, he wrote The Children of Mu and reissued The Lost Continent of Mu. Sacred Symbols of Mu followed in 1932, and in 1934 and 1935 he came out with the Cosmic Forces of Mu in 2 volumes. So he moved to Los Angeles in December of 1931, and unfortunately the next month he passed away. He's buried in Valhalla, New York, in the Kensico Cemetery with many other illustrious individuals. Now, James obtained his information when said he was on famine relief duty in India in the 1870s. He said he befriended a rishi of a local temple after he looked at the symbols on the side of the temple walls, and eventually the rishi took the opportunity to teach him for 2 years. Some sources say it was 5, but James said that they taught him for 2 years, and was occasionally mentioned these old tablets that were available and that were being hidden down in the temple archives. And after a while, his initial pleadings to see them, the rishi said no. But James finally was able to see them, and when the rishi was very excited because he hadn't seen them in quite a few years. So after they put them away, James repacked them and repaired them as best he could. And they also looked over it and interpreted them together. Now, James writes that the rishi and his family had been around there for thousands of years, guarding and taking care of the temple and the records. And he was from a Naga family from the original Lost Common Mu, and a member of the Nikal Brotherhood, and one of only 3 adepts that were still around. So let's talk about some of the theories that James discovered from the Nikal tablets. First of all, he believed that man's creation, or that the creation of the world, the universe was a silent void until all the 7 superior intellects of the great creator read out these 7 great commands. These 7 great commands go pretty much exactly like the account in Genesis, except on the last day, instead of God resting, man was created, a special creation to rule the world. James said that the Nikal tablets tell us that they were either 200,000 or 270,000 years ago, that man was created, like I said, with a special purpose to rule the world in his stead, and that we are a special creation. And that over the next 200,000 years or so, that man developed the ability to understand the cosmic forces and the world around them. From these abilities that they gained, they had an advanced civilization. The monumental constructions, they had a global sailing skill, which translates to they could get anywhere they wanted all around the world. And no section of their population lacked food or shelter. Now, life on Mu, although James doesn't outline or provide any enumeration of what life on Mu was like, we can speculate. First of all, I would imagine that they were all well-read and very literate. They had a relaxed and unhurried lifestyle because they understood what life was about and what was going on around them. They also had the superior goods due to the fact that people didn't have a profit motive. They weren't following the lean process that everybody does today to take all the goodness out of it. And there was also a plethora of fine goods available from around the world. They weren't stuck with just the local apple juice. They could get it prune juice from across the sea if they wanted. So in order to maintain this civilization, they would have had to form, and they did form, a Nikal Brotherhood, which was their name. And they had to form this organization to keep the teachings alive, to ensure that they created and maintained schools so that individuals would be able to follow on for the next generations. That hundreds of thousands of books were supposedly in their libraries, some dating back as far as 70,000 years, James states. There were also the missionaries that transferred this knowledge to all the colonies where they traveled and where men lived. From James' writings, I learned that they had a colonial capital that would start off with 5,000, a copy of 5,000 of the tablets, which would be, I guess, the core library. And then from that, they would make 6 copies, and these would be distributed and become the 7 Rishi cities of that colony. Now, James, in the 1927 Gold Age, books of the Golden Age, writes that there was an entire library removed from the remains of the great Uyghur, the capital city of the great Uyghur Empire in the middle of the Gobi Desert, and that they were transported to Kanasa, Tibet. And this is a look at what it looked like, the rock-hewn face of the temple. He also said that other exhibits, but this is the only one he actually identified. And I knew everyone would want to see the bigger map so they could perhaps better pinpoint where it was. Now, James also said that since Mu was the birthplace of mankind, he attempted to show how the different people colonized the earth. This is the Eastern, showing here how, oh, there it is, showing how, here shows the Carian that went through and colonized Asia, Asia Minor rather, and the Mediterranean. He also used a term that's probably not, I just lost connection. Oh, good, I didn't. I got it. He also used a term that's outdated today to say that the people of Africa, what he termed the Negroid races, traveled through the Amazonian Sea, and I'll show you another slide of that, and colonized the southern tip of Atlantis as well as the continent of Africa. As this shows, at one time, James believed that the South America had an Amazonian Sea where the Amazonian basin is right now, and that the mountains had not risen, which the Andes Mountains, which normally run around here, they had not risen yet, so people were able to sail straight through, land there on Atlantis on their way, and go on to Africa. And James mentions that he found this map in a monastery in Tibet, maybe even Kanasa. Okay, well, I got that. Hello? Oh, okay. Woo. I'll try to be more careful. Continuing with the Eastern colonization of the world from Mu, you can see here where the North America and Central America was also colonized. Now looking at the Western, James shows here where the Uyghur people left, and here's their capital city. The Naga people came this way and colonized Burma, India, and then became the people from Babylon and Akkadians. And also there were the Tamils that went south, and I'm out. Yes, please. And this shows the lines of people that came through. These would be the Tamil people. And next. This shows the Great Uyghur Empire. And again, this.
Just tell me, just show that.
Okay. Go back. This shows the Great Uyghur Empire, also the lines of the colonization, and provides an opportunity for actually a color map that he presented. Catastrophes. James believed in that catastrophes had brought down Mu, not once but twice. The first time were some earthquakes that brought down some of the civilization and killed a lot of people, and the people rebuilt and became confident, and then eventually they were destroyed by the collapse of the Archean gas belts. Now, in these next few slides, I'd like to demonstrate what James said about the collapse of these Archean gas belts. As you can see, progressively the lava starts to flow upwards, eventually causing pressure, cracks, breaking onto another set of the Archean gas belts. Eventually they break through to the surface where the volcanoes explode. Once everything collapses, the water just rushes in. And this is what James believed ended the civilization. This is just one of the maps that James provides in his books on how the Archean gas belts were around the world. He was very keen to keep many notes in his scrapbook on volcanoes and earthquakes and whatnot. James also believed that there was a magnetic cataclysm at the time which caused a north-running ice wave and wiped out the eastern half of the Uyghur Empire. The drawing on the left shows what he believed that would look like to the people that were there. Now, I'd like to take a bottom line look at James' theories. Now, as Goldor said, mainstream looks at James saying that there was a continent in the middle of the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and they immediately say, "Oh no, you're crazy," and that's where everything stops when they talk about it, because they don't want to talk any further. But as I've shown, that wasn't the only thing James talks about. For instance, here's a sunken landmass. It's called Sudaland, and we saw a little map of it earlier where the people were coming through, the Tamils were coming through. But at the end of the last ice age, all that in gray, it was a landmass. It's on the Pacific Ocean, and was there. They're pretty sure it's there. But we're looking at all the fossils of the hominids that were previously discovered, Australopithecus, Cro-Magnon, and all those, and we're discovering that they're fossils. But what if the fossils didn't have the opportunity to form here? We can also point to, there are other land masses that have sunk. Just Doggerland is one, Heraklion, the lost city of Dwarka. I can even point to that in the Gulf of Mexico, which is real close to my house. So not all fossils are equal. You can't prove to me that because we haven't found the fossil doesn't mean that those folks didn't exist. And the lack of evidence is not lack of existence. But now James said that there was no evolution. Now, recent discoveries have indicated that we have the DNA of the Flores hobbit, what they call him, the Neanderthal, as well as the Denisova people that were discovered in a cave in Siberia. So humans share all these DNA with all these other hominids, which provides us the opportunity for widely varying DNA combinations. Now, all these different DNA combinations can provide us with different appearing people, with different abilities. They can have different physical abilities, different mental abilities, and different appearances. So, not all of us know of what our minds can do. We all have untapped, unrecognized abilities, whether you knew it or not. And the Tibetan adepts do know some of these. For instance, in the 6 yogas of Naropa, I'll give one example of Tumo. In the Tumo, in a demonstration of Tumo, a monk was videotaped and they had witnesses standing there. They took his outer robe, dunked it in water, and laid it on top of him. And he entered in his meditative state, performed his practice, and pretty soon you started to see the steam rise off of his robes until eventually it was bone dry. Now, I myself don't know how that was done. Eventually, with a lot of study, I might be able to determine, but all of us, I believe, have seen things that we don't understand. We don't know the causes, but it really did happen. Now, the catch to this is that somebody with these abilities would be unwilling to show them to other individuals. This demonstration on Tumo was done with quite a bit of reluctance, but they wanted to demonstrate it. A person that has these abilities are not the end result. They're not the goal. They're an end product of their teachings and their meditational abilities. And the fact is that they really have lost their ego and they don't need to tell anybody that they have this power. And the reason I'm mentioning is that individuals who undertake these attempts at practices and whatnot can be dangerous. They're very dangerous in that it can affect your mind and hurt you really not very well. So now that we have this varying individuals, varying DNA, populations of DNA, they can take along their intellectual abilities and apply science over 200,000 years to provide the opportunity to learn how to manipulate the cosmic forces, or they can just require training to get their inherent abilities. But what if there was a special population? They had this perfect DNA where they had the opportunity they were intellectually and or technologically advanced in that they knew what was going on when they were born. And all of us know about the indigo children and some of the individuals that just pop up and, how did you know that? We don't know how they did it, but it's in their DNA. And so this special population would obviously have good governance and provide food and shelter for all, and we could identify them as an advanced civilization. Obviously, if you were going to keep this civilization going, you'd want to form a brotherhood. I won't use the same name as James, but they had to be the keepers of the knowledge. They had to have libraries where they kept this knowledge recorded. They had to create and maintain colleges and schools. And they also had to proselytize, go out to each of the colonies and tell everyone to maintain this teaching so that they maintained their civilization. Also, they'd have to protect the faith from people who would wish them harm. So allow me to summarize. James believed that there was a sunken Pacific Ocean continent. Now, I used the example of Sundaland, but I could have said Yonaguni or Okinawa, or maybe they were both all the same thing. Man was a special creation. Well, I made a wild speculation that we could possibly have a special population through DNA of hominids. James said that they had special powers. I think that maybe it's possible that the other civilization could have had special powers. An advanced civilization would appear advanced to a not special group of people. And obviously we'd have this brotherhood to maintain the teachings, the lifestyle and the civilization that they had become used to. But what is unstated so far, and maybe I've stated it, but I wish to reiterate that man has a divine spark in him, and that was one of James' points. Whether this divine spark, whether it was a unique DNA or whatever, we have that divine spark in us. We also is the realization of our shared human existence, the fact that we're all on this earth together, that we all come from a special place, that we're all together, we all have the same backgrounds, we all came from the same group of people, and that at one time everybody worked together, everybody got along together. And I guess if we realize this, perhaps we would have the opportunity to get back to what our birthright is as the children of Mu, or the descendants of them. So if I'm going to look at some of the next steps in order to try to regain our birthright, I could study my great-grandfather's books on the cosmic forces of Mu. I started to read that. We could try to find the Nakal tablets. We'll take an expedition off to Kanasa, Tibet. Unfortunately, if we don't find any of the Nakal Brotherhoods, we're not going to know what's on those tablets. So maybe we'll try to find the Nakal Brotherhood. My only problem is that what evidence do you look for to find them? And so we'll have to build up a list of that. And the other thing is, what if they don't want us to find them? Now, the Rishi told James that he was capable, and demonstrated to James that he was capable of astral travel. He was able to mesmerize people into believing what he wanted them to believe, as well as telepathy and a few other special powers that he had. So that's where if we're not doing any of those things, we have to get to some place where we find a way to get back and just rediscover our birthright. So let me take a few minutes to discuss my book, Lifting the Veil on the Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men. Now, I believe that this is the definitive edition of the 1926 Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men. This was James' first book on Mu. He obviously wrote other books on sporting and things, but this was his first book on Mu. Short synopsis, I've probably already covered a lot of it, but again, it was a Pacific Ocean continent of Mu. He wrote that the Nakal Brotherhood was there, and they had the sacred inspired tablets, hundreds of thousands of them, and that cataclysms sunk Mu, Atlantis, and the Great Uyghur Empire. And James writes quite succinctly about finding and translating the tablets with and interacting with the Rishi. On chapter 1, page 1 of this book, James says that the Garden of Eden was Mu. There were 6 million inhabitants. They were 50,000 years old, and their technology was superior to that of the 20th century. Now, essentially, the first 6 chapters or 7 chapters of his book detail all James' evidence that he discovered of Mu. In chapters 8 and 9, he goes through the different symbols that he discovered. Chapters 10 through 12, he speaks about all the evidence discovered in America, the Denman of Nebraska, the Nivens discoveries in near central in Mexico. Chapter 13, he goes into detail on Mu's geography. Chapter 14, he explains that before Mu had sunk, there was no savagery on Earth. Everybody got along, everybody was great, but all of a sudden when the infrastructure dropped out from underneath them, they became savages, and we have developed from that is what was James' thought. Then James gets into some ancient religious conceptions. He talks about these ancient sacred mysteries and the rites and the ceremonies and how they related to the symbols and the remembrance of Mu. And in chapter 17, he talks about the coping stone, or he relates about the divine spark that sets us apart from every other creation. Now, I have, in The Lost Continent of Mu, this book, I have reproduced the entire contents of the original. I even kept the page numbers, although to save a few trees, we condensed it a bit so there wouldn't be quite as many pages. But if you use the index that I've created, or you refer to the page number in the original, both page numbers will match, so that you don't have to throw out your old copies. I've also created a persons of interest index. Usually, I went through and I attempted to find out all the people that he mentioned in the book, used as references. If I was able to obtain a brief biography concerning them, they got an entry in the appendix. If I had a little less information, they at least got a footnote. Then there was the printed works that James refers to. I did the same as well, presenting all the works, what they were quoted. If I was able to go and obtain that quote from elsewhere, I presented the original as well so that you could see all of it. And I've also added 270 new footnotes to the book. One thing I do, and I created an index, but one thing that makes this unique is that I had copies of James' scrapbooks that I was able to refer to, some of the original source material for some of his articles and some of his chapters in the book. Now, this book opens new avenues of research. I can give some examples. For instance, William Niven and his buried cities of Mexico. James chapter, I believe 12, is entitled Buried Mexican Cities. The original article that almost the entire chapter came from is contained in the scrapbook. It was contained in his scrapbook and has been reproduced as a footnote so that you can read the entire article, the original article, including the scratched out portions where James did not include that particular sentence and whatnot, so you can determine what the difference is. There's the article on the Denmen of Nebraska, the individuals who lived in what the current scientists call wallows, the buffalo wallows. They were able to find Phoenician, Chinese statues, carvings, and whatnot at the bottom of these, and they developed the name of the Denmen of Nebraska. So if you wanted to explore that a bit more, there was an article contained in James' scrapbooks included in the book. Now, Pyotr Kozlov was a Russian army officer, and he, in James' book, when they're discussing the great Uyghur Empire, discovered a great city in the Uyghur capital city is what they called it, and he dug down and discovered these amazing, the tombs of the 7 Tartar kings is what it's in the original article it says. And James writes part of one of his books, part of one of the chapters is all about the Uyghur Empire. And I had been searching and searching for the information on corroborative information to say, where's another source of information on this? I can read about it in James' book, but where else? Well, if you want to find something else about it, you could pick up Lifting the Veil on the Lost Continent of Mu and get the entire article that details the Kozlov's discoveries in Central Asia. And this is the symbol that James believed was the royal escutcheon of Mu. But I'd like to leave you with these thoughts. Each of us have a piece of the divine spark, and the theory of Mu offers a birthright, a peaceful, cooperative planet, free from strife, once everybody understands our shared human existence. Now, I'd like to take questions at this time. If anybody'd like to ask a question, please come over here to the
Let me have the mic for just a minute. I want to ask him something. Hey, James, while they're figuring out who wants to ask a question, I do want you to tell the story that the people that time, the 20s when he wrote these books, nobody believed him. They all thought he was crazy. Even your own family, you said, disowned him.
Well, yes.
He was way ahead of his time.
When James left India, yes, he when he took a trip through the Pacific Ocean and developed a lot of his research. His wife, I showed a picture of her. Maybe I can get back to it. Nope, it's still off. But in there was a picture of my great-grandmother, Lady Julia Stephenson.
That way we get you on camera too.
Almost. And here, one more, a little more,
This time I will.
one more. Right there. The other older picture that occurs earlier, this is Louise Hare, who was James' common-law wife. And this is another reason why they weren't too happy with my great-grandfather, because when he won the settlement, he immediately turned it into the property, but it wasn't in his name. This is his common-law wife, Louise Hare, that purchased the property. So the family was pretty angry. My father spent summers with my great-grandmother at her home. She was a very angry woman because of several reasons, not the least of which was this. And so when I went to school and somebody first asked me about the lost continent of Mu, I went home and I said, "Hey, Dad, Mom, they're talking about my great-grandfather. He wrote books." And so he'd never read them. He didn't care anything about them. But the reason I've undertaken this research is that that's my background. This is all hooey. On the other hand, everybody's asking me questions and telling about how this has helped them and what a uplifting thing this is for humankind. So I had to take this research upon myself to see if there was any truth involved. And so that's why I undertook lifting the veil to write the book and provide more information, not just for me, but for other people who wanted to further study the subject.
I get to ask a question this time. How can this be related to the I Am books where Bertie Spalding, he does write about the tablets in Tibet and in Nepal, remember? About some tablets that were, so is there any relation with James Churchward's, or was that way before? You're familiar with the I Am books?
You're talking about Bertie Spalding.
Bertie Spalding's books,
Right.
Because he talks. So what your great-grandfather, right?
Correct.
Wrote sounds it's true, because Bertie Spalding. See, I had never heard about James Churchward. He wrote about all this not rishis, but people who would appear and disappear, astral travel, etc., etc. So how is there any relation to?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. Actually, James' books, when he wrote them out by hand, were published by Bertie Spalding's wife. And there is another book that was written, and I hope to eventually find it and obtain it one day. I have like 4 or 5 pages of it in the cover. It's called The Colonies of Mu, and it was like a 400 or 500 page book that Mr. Spalding's wife, Mrs. Spalding, typed out on the typewriter, but I guess the publisher wouldn't take it. So it eventually became what is known as Children of Mu, which with a lot of redaction I was just hoping to catch an eye and see what else he wrote, what is missing from the children of Mu.
Thank you for all your sharing. Can you clarify for us, is Lemuria and Mu two different locations, two different things, or one and the same? And was there any in the research about visitation from beings from elsewhere, like star visitors to any of these colonies?
To answer your first question, as I presented earlier, in my view, Lemuria was a continent proposed by Schlachter in 1864 to talk about why there was lemurs around the Indian Ocean basin. Later, Haeckel said that this was, he proposed that it was the birthplace of mankind. Mu, on the other hand, was something my great-grandfather came up with obviously in his 1926 book when they broke ground on it, when he broke with a groundbreaking book he wrote to define that it was a Pacific Ocean continent. As I showed earlier with somebody renaming the map, that has shown that other people believe that Mu was Lemuria, that they need to add an extra L-E and R-I-A to it. But Madame Blavatsky in the late 19th century also spoke about Lemuria, and I'm not sure where the location for her Lemuria was. But in my mind, the two are separate. But obviously other people can call it that. James came up with the name Mu from his interaction with the Rishi and from reading the Nikal tablets. And your second question?
Was there any indication in your research that there was star brother communication with them?
James does not outline that and doesn't mention that at all.
Because it was unheard of in those days.
Well, actually it wasn't. Actually, Madame Blavatsky, yes, Madame Blavatsky also came up with some of the guardians that had come.
It goes back that far. I didn't think it went back that far. That's good to know. Okay, I want to thank Jack for bringing all of this back, all of his great-grandfather's work back.